I'm a little overwhelmed, as you can imagine. Chris, in all honesty, I've never been introduced in such a beautiful way before. So I don't know how you had time to reach out to people in the midst of all of this, but it shows your generosity of spirit, so thank you for that. Thank you, Garth. Thank you, Gina. Thank you, everyone, for coming tonight. I was coming over to this event tonight, and I was thinking that I'm actually also here for my 20th reunion, and wondering how 20 years went so fast and how I got old so fast. But then it struck me that in many ways, it's so exciting, and I'm really happy to see my classmates, but when I think about coming home at the business school, it's really to this community. It's all of the people that made my experience when I was at Stanford so wonderful, and it's certainly, interestingly, become even more wonderful since I left. So I was thinking about all the different things I wanted to talk about tonight, and how honored I am that I was asked to share my story, because it's certainly only one of so many stories in this room. And in fact, if you were to draw a virtual map around the institutions, the ideas, the organizations that have been impacted by the many people just in this room, you could start to imagine a sea of ripples that kind of go across the United States into the ends of the earth. When I was walking through, noticing people, founders, supporters of organizations like Habitat for Humanity, the Entrepreneurs Foundation, Three Guineas Foundation, Kiva, Embrace, Gates Foundation, Skoll Foundation, a Midjar Network, all of these institutions that are different because, or would never have been born without this group of people, without this community. And so, again, it's a real honor to be part of you. And Dean Miller, I know that you've been introduced by Dean Patel, Jim Patel, but I spent a lot of the weekend researching the early beginnings of the PMP, the Urban Management Program, and then the CSI, with the help of Bill Meehan and John Steinhardt, and was really blown away by who you were and are as an individual. And what really struck me is not just all of your accomplishments as the head of Ford Motor Company, but how you were as a leader. And there were three things that really impacted me the most. One was this idea that was really brought into Stanford that if we're going to solve big, hairy social problems, we need all sectors, we need all disciplines, and we need the flexibility to learn how to work among them. But the second was really the audacity and humility with which you walk, in which you were courageous enough to embrace failure, talk about failure, and share the lessons of failure. And it's certainly something in this political environment that we need more of today. And then the third was that you really believe in ideas and the spread of ideas, but you understand that institutions endure. And it was really exciting for me to read about how you built an enduring institution that could continually renew itself. So I also just want to acknowledge and thank you for the spirit with which you infuse this organization. And we stand on your shoulders, and we also stand on the shoulders of the other founders like John, who helped build this institution and make it what it is today. So thank you. So I was trying to think about how to share my story, and I really believe in the poetry of the universe. And so the story of the PMP really started in 1967. And I also happened to be living in Detroit, Michigan in 1967. I was attending kindergarten. My father had just come back from Vietnam, and in 1968 he would go back to Vietnam. And his job that year was to knock on doors in the inner city, Detroit, and tell mothers that their sons had just been killed. And I remember as a little girl listening to my mom and dad talk about issues of race and the riots and joblessness in America and how mad the world felt then. And I remember feeling determined that I was going to make the world better. And when I think 40 years later, what's so exciting to me is the world really is a better world. The world we've inherited is a more hopeful world. We're more connected than we've ever been in all of history. We can see each other across the planet. We have technology, we have resources, we have imagination. If ever there was a time for us to renew this spirit and find the solutions, it is now. So fast forward, I left university, I became a commercial banker. I was primarily focused in Latin America. I learned that I loved the power of business, the power of investing, but I also saw that low-income people were pretty much excluded from the banks then and now. And that took me to Kigali, Rwanda, where I worked with a very small group of very prominent women to start the country's first microfinance organization. And I loved seeing that a small group of people really could change the world, really understood that we were being part of history. We became the largest lender very quickly in that country. But 3 years into it, realized that I wanted to gain more skills, more tools to do this in a bigger and better way. And many of the African men also called me Msichana Kidogo, which in Kiswahili means little girl, which was something I never wanted to be called. So I thought it was time to just explore the idea of an MBA. Because maybe if I had those initials, people would think I was more grown up and powerful. But I didn't really know where to apply. And this was pre-internet. So finding an application from Kigali, Rwanda, took a really long time. It was about 2 weeks to get to the States to ask for the application and 2 weeks to come back. So I only asked for applications from Harvard and Stanford, thinking that I had ambivalence, quite frankly, about whether I would become an MBA or not. But if I was, I thought these would be two good schools to look at. And again, in the poetry of the universe, the applications arrived at the post office on the same day. And I remember looking at the 2 annual reports and applications. I opened up Stanford, and there was all this talk of values, the importance of bringing business tools to the public sector as well as to business. And so in probably what was a very rash decision, I decided I was only applying to 1 school. And if I didn't get in, there was another path, because I also thought I might become an anthropologist. And luckily enough, I got into Stanford. And I remember coming here and being overwhelmed and still not knowing whether I would ever fit into this place, but finding an incredible nest of wonderful spirits, friends, all who were part of the public management program, and friends who remain some of the closest people in my life today. Those of us who were there, the late 80s, early 90s, were really blessed to learn from great professors, people like Jim Collins, who would push us and make us think about what it meant to craft a life, or Jeff Pfeffer, who urged us to learn how to navigate power and politics if we wanted to have influence in any part of our lives, or Jim Patel, who even back then was asking us to think about distant horizons and become global citizens. And I thank you for that, Jim. We were supported by you, Jim Thompson, and Allison Davis, who were leading the PMP at the time and really believed in this whole idea. But there was no single individual who impacted me more than a man named John Gardner, who was the Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare under the Johnson administration, and went on to create incredible organizations like Common Cause, the independent sector, many of the organizations that really form part of our civil society. And I remember meeting him like it was yesterday. I was sitting with my buddy Tony Brown, listening to the professors talk about the classes that they were offering for the next semester, classes like linear programming and vector analysis. We would learn about the Black-Scholes theory, and I was like, uh-huh. And then this man in his late 70s, full of elegance, tall, wearing a houndstooth jacket and a fedora, came to the podium, and with a sweep of his hand, he said, "Why do civilizations rise and fall? Why do some of us renew and stay curious and alive and want to change the world long into our 70s, 80s, and even 90s? And others of us, at age 30, start feeling dispirited, discouraged, get on the couch, and never really get off again. I'm going to teach about organizational and individual renewal." And I knew my life had changed at that moment. I marched myself into his office and asked him to be my mentor. And we started a conversation that lasted until the week he died. And I think about him literally every day. There were many things that John said, and I know that many of the people in this room were influenced and continue to be influenced by his memory. And he would speak in really simple phrases. So once when I had been offered this very fancy job with a prestigious title and big salary, John said, well, will this job make you more interesting or allow you to be more interested? Which was a really good question, and of course I didn't take the job. He would say, commit to something bigger than yourself, and you will find in that commitment the greatest freedom that you would know. And he would say that, like you, RJ, that he saw he would say insoluble problems are just, he would say great opportunities are disguised as insoluble problems. And the trick is to break down those problems into their component parts and just start. Wherever you can, just start and let the work teach you and move forward step by step. And I would say that both John Gardner and R.J. Miller understood in a way that all of us can learn from, that true legacy lies not only in the fortunes that we amass and the names that we put on buildings, but in the institutions that we help shape and in the ideas that we bring to the world, and most importantly, by the people that we touch in really fundamental ways. And when I'm at Acumen or at Stanford and I'm talking to the next generation and I hear John's words and I see his values in action, I am reminded about what real renewal and what real rebirth look like, and am reminded that none of us really ever have to die if we could just stay fully alive every day that we're on this planet. So I feel incredibly lucky to have been given the gift of John Gardner by Stanford Business School and the public management program. So I left Stanford. I worked in philanthropy at Rockefeller Foundation and in leadership. And here's where the story of Acumen starts. And I tell this story because this is not a one person's story. This is a collective community story. And it continues to be so. One of the participants in the philanthropy workshop, which was I was teaching at Rockefeller, was my good friend Kate Muther. And Kate had been a Silicon Valley entrepreneur, worked in a lot of the founding companies, and was really interested in what it would take to change philanthropy altogether, and was pulling together a group of philanthropists to think about new models. And at the same time, I had gotten extremely frustrated that neither markets would work when trying to solve problems of poverty, nor would top-down approaches to aid and charity, and so was also looking for new models, and so became part of this small group that would brainstorm and dream. And this ultimately turned into the idea of Acumen Fund, but as Bill Meehan would attest, we didn't still fully understand what we were doing, even though he did do the first case study about us in that period. And he introduced me to one of his best students, Brian Trelstead, who's become a dear partner and colleague, who was our first unofficial summer intern before we were anything. And a few years later, Brian would come back and become our CFO and then our Chief Investment Officer. And with many of the people in this room, Brian has really been an architect for many of the structures that are forming what is emerging as the social impact investing sector. A few years after Brian, another one of Bill's students, Yasmina Zaidman, came on the team. She now runs communications. And then the funders, the partners, came on board and really supported Acumen. Not only Kate, Louis Borston was at Gates Foundation, gave us our first significant grant to look at water, and really worked as a partner, pushing us, making us better, falling down with us sometimes. And I'll tell you the story of one of the things that Louis helped really bring to the world. Gibb and Susan Myers, Laurent Debiok, many of the people in this room worked in that manner. I look around the room, I see fellows, interns that worked at Acumen Fund. And what really excites me is now we're starting to give back. In these 2 years, first and second year classes, we have 4 Acumen Fund Acumen Fund team members and fellows. So the very endeavor came from community, and that community is incredibly interconnected to this community. And I actually think this is the way organizations are going to move in the future. But the idea of Acumen was based on this idea of patient capital, that because markets and government weren't working alone, could we find those entrepreneurs who were daring to go into places where nothing else was working? Particularly when it came time to bring issues of water, healthcare, housing, energy to low-income people. What we didn't understand then was all the things they were truly fighting, because not only were they going to places that were often like ground zero, but they were fighting high levels of corruption, almost no infrastructure, unbelievably low levels of trust, because people had seen so many well-intended projects come and go, and they needed time. They needed time to experiment, they needed time to fail, they needed time to learn from their failures. And we thought time meant 5 to 7 years. Now we understand it's more like 10 to 15 years. And yet, what we're seeing is that it really works. Patient capital has allowed the company that Lewis has been working with us for almost 7 years now, Water Health International, started with 1 plant in India and now has 400, catchment area of about 4 million people who have access to clean drinking water. And by the end of the year, we think there'll be 200 more of these plants in Bangladesh and now moving into West Africa. We invested in an ambulance company when there were 10 ambulances in India. Today there are 650, 3,500 employees serving 500,000 people this year. And a long-lasting malaria bed net manufacturer in Tanzania that started off with no bed nets, but today employs 8,000 people, mostly low-income women. It represents 20% of all manufacturing jobs in the country, making 29 million bed nets a year. That accounts for 15% of the world's global distribution. So patient capital allows all of this to happen. But the story that I want to share in a little bit more detail is another story that comes from here. It's the story of Delight. Jim Patel's class on extreme affordability pushes students to think about what does it take to bring goods and services to people who make $1, $2, $3 a day. He had 2 wonderful students, Sam Goldman, Ned Tozum, who were dreaming about bringing a safe, affordable, clean light to the masses who were too dependent on very dirty, high-polluting, expensive kerosene. And so Sam and Ned came out with a solar torch. Cost about $36, which made a lot of sense. You could charge your battery as well. And they started working with, I'm sure, a number of alumni in this room, including Yasmina and Brian on our team. Ultimately, Katie Hill, who was our portfolio manager in India, is now at the business school, advocated to get this investment done. An Acumen fund invested first at the prototype level, and we have invested in several rounds since. Heidi Crowell, who now works at New Island Capital, was a fellow for a year working on marketing, and today Delight is bringing safe, affordable, clean light to 3.5 million people around the world, and they are just getting started. And this community especially should be so proud to be bringing forth entrepreneurs in the world like Sam and Ned. And just last week, I was tagged in a post on Facebook by Ned, and in the post was a picture of him sitting in an auto rickshaw in Lahore, Pakistan. And the auto rickshaw had advertisement on it for one of Acumen's advisors' companies, a company called Rosie, which is like the monster.com of low-income Pakistan. And he was saying how he loved Pakistan, which I was very excited by because we want to see Delight go into that country as well. And I was thinking to myself that Ned can go to Pakistan in part because our whole team is there to embrace him, to show him a different side. But it goes beyond this team. It goes to these advisors who embrace him as well as part of the community. And that when I was thinking about it and thinking about tonight, that real change comes no longer from any monolithic institution, but it comes from the relationships that we build often across institutions. And that maybe the kind of architecture and structures we need to be creating together are really about forming a new kind of ecosystem whereby some people get paid, some people don't get paid, institutions work together on specific problems. But we have different measures for recognizing input and output and change. And that it's to us who are part of this community and the challenge to the Center for Social Innovation to start to imagine and then create a much more collaborative marketplace, one that sees as its mission using the tools of management and business truly to solve the social problems of our time. One of my, I love poetry, but one poet who I certainly really love is Seamus Heaney, the great Irish poet. And in one of his poems, he talks about times when hope and history rhyme. And I've also been thinking a lot about hope, and what is hope, particularly now in a cynical time of great turmoil and tumult. And I think that hope can be very dangerous if it's flaccid, simple, just idealistic and naive. That the kind of hope you need in cynical, turbulent times is hard-edged, it's hard-earned. It comes from experience and falling down and moving into sometimes dangerous areas, and that it's our job, it's this institution's job to create hope in a way that starts with building the kinds of models the world needs for the future. Models that really dare to even think about language and how we use language around stakeholder models, or even what does fiduciary responsibility mean in a world where, as Garth was saying, we'll have 7 billion people as of next week, and increasing resource scarcity, particularly when we're looking at water and climate change. How do we think about addressing these issues? But when I really think about hope, I think about the next generation. I think about the faces of the students at this university, in our business school, and the students, the young people that I get to meet at Acumen. And I actually think that this generation is better than our generation. They are more global, they're more connected, they are demanding sustainability, they will push the new kinds of institutions. And so in the spirit of R.J. Miller and John Gardner, I keep asking myself, well, what do we do so that they feel comfortable standing on the shoulders of us? What can Stanford as an institution do? But more importantly, what can each of us do to reach out, to nurture, to inspire, to link, to share, so that they can be as big as they can possibly be, because this world has never needed a generation like it needs this one. I remember one time when I was at Stanford, and John was talking to the then former Secretary of State, George Shultz, and feeling kind of, embarrassed. I thought I would sneak by and he wouldn't notice, but of course I hear this, Jacqueline, and so I came over and he gave me a big hug and put his arm around me and introduced me to the Secretary of State, and I felt flustered and I had no idea what to say. I felt somewhat stupid after. But then I started thinking, actually, I just felt really big. John just made me feel really big and kind of important. And here was a man who really didn't give a fig about title or position. He measured himself and he measured the people around him by the way they lived their values, by the actions that they took, by how much they dared, to you, Jim, the nobility of teaching others to be good. And that if he could make the world a better place just by being in it, maybe I could make the world a better place just by being in it too. And so I just end with that thought from John, from this institution, about what that will take in a world that too often moves to the cynical rather than recognizing what we have, and that we, the privileged, more than ever, have an opportunity like no other generation has ever had to reach out, to extend, to believe in the possibility of our ideas, the possibility of our institutions, but most important, in the possibility of each other. And so on this, the anniversary, the 40th anniversary of the PMP and the CSI and this whole idea of innovation at Stanford Business School, may we all recommit to those ideas and ideals inside ourselves, inside of our organizations, certainly to Stanford and to the Center for Social Innovation and the PMP. And through that renewal and through our recommitment, I think I can fairly say that the future will be better than the past, and that we're just getting started, and the world better watch out for this institution and everything that comes from it. So thank you very much.